Guys, we're going to get started here in about 2 to 3 minutes. Just going to wait for a couple more people to join. Please make sure as you enter the meeting, if you're not muted, please mute yourself. We'll ask you guys to come off of mute at some point to ask questions and things like that. Also, please do me a favor, if at all possible, there's controls down at the bottom of your meeting. Only let the presenter present. So don't hit that present button if at all possible. Going to get started here in 2 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Rob Foster with the Vigilon. It's now 12 o'clock. We'll give it a couple more minutes to let everybody join, and then we'll get started.
Rob, are you good to go?
I am good to go. Thank you for the backup.
No problem, man.
Okay, for those of you all just joining, this is Rob Foster with the Vigilon. I'm going to be presenting today. Just going to give it about 1 more minute. We got still a few people joining here. Then we'll get started. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. It's 2 after the hour. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Just a couple of housekeeping items. First is I want to make sure that everybody can see my screen, displaying a PowerPoint slide right now that says the Vigilon Access Control Manager getting started. And also, hopefully, everybody can hear me.
Yep, you're good.
And it sounds like awesome. So what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of go back to basics. And, you know, we're going to go through things here that, you know, some of this content you're already going to know. And but hopefully there's going to be some new information here as well. And really what we want to focus on today is getting ACM set up correctly from the beginning. One of the things that myself and the other SEs have been doing is doing health checks on systems that are currently deployed. And I'll kind of share some of those things that we're finding as we go through this. The things that we're finding that are issues and could potentially be problems in the future. So I'll try to save some time at the end for questions In the meantime, if you all could stay on mute, just to kind of cut down on the background noise. But at the end of the presentation, we'll open it up for questions. Feel free to ask those verbally, or if you prefer, you can submit those questions in the chat. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So kind of the objectives, which I've already talked about a little bit, but just review the initial configuration, make sure we get it right. And hopefully as a result, we're going to cut down on your installation time, reduce misconfiguration issues, and ultimately make our end user happy. So just a quick review, just kind of a level set here. And the reason I put this slide up here is because regardless of whether you get a professional level appliance, an enterprise or enterprise plus, or you go the virtual route, the setup is going to be the same. So it's going to apply to all, doesn't matter whether you're doing hardware or virtual. Now, one thing I want to remind everybody of, because this comes up a lot, ACM runs as a headless server. And what I mean by that is there's no monitor or keyboard connected to the server. For those of you that have attempted that, you've probably gotten a screen that looks like this. And then you probably tried the default username and password here, and you probably got no luck. You got nowhere. So really where you want to start is here with the browse interface. So instead of connecting the monitor and the keyboard directly to the appliance, get out your laptop. You could take in the case of a physical appliance, you can take an Ethernet cord, connect directly from your laptop to one of the ports on the back of the appliance. And just again, some very basic information, but this does come up a lot, just the default IP addresses that are installed on the machine when you get it from the factory. So port 1, this is the port you're going to set up to connect to the customer's network. Port 2 is not routable. So keep that in mind. I like to call this a service port. So use port 2 when you need to connect to ACM with your laptop. It's also good if you come back for service and you're in a highly secure environment where the IT group turns ports on and off, per device. Sometimes you don't have a port to plug into. So if you keep port 2 open on the appliance, then you will always be able to connect. Obviously, a strategy doesn't work as well in a virtual environment, but for the environments that do have an appliance, you can utilize that. So also remember, use default username and password, admin, and of course the password is admin. Now you'll notice on newer versions of ACM that you're required to change the password the first time you log in. Just a helpful hint, if you're still doing the install and you've got multiple technicians that are coming in and out of the site, you may want to go ahead and set that password back to admin, or make sure you set it to a password that you remember. If you forget the password, you're going to have a very bad day. It is not an easy process to reset the default password. It's going to require you to contact tech support. It's going to require you to get an old modem cable to hook up to your laptop. It's going to be a bad day. So I know this is kind of a trivial matter, but make sure that when you do set the password, you remember it, or at least set it back to default until until you're ready to turn it over to the customer. So with that being said, we'll kind of jump into the system here, walk through some of the initial installation steps, and go from there. So what I've done, I have configured a few things on the system really just to save time. So let me start over here. So here, and I'll point out the things that I've already configured that you don't typically see by default. But first thing I configured, when you first boot up the system, it's going to make you set the appliance name and the host name. Now in this case, I went ahead and set this information just because once I save this, it's going to reboot the appliance. Obviously, I don't want to waste 2 minutes of your lives, while we wait for the appliance to reboot, so I've already set that. Now, what I would go to next typically when I would set up a system, after I set the appliance name and host name, I would go to my name server and my time server. Here, both of these things, every time I get into a system, well, I shouldn't say every time, I'd say about 50% of the time that I log into a system, neither one of these are filled out. Now, with the name server, where you're going to run into issues is when you actually try to activate the license. In 6.0, we have a new license scheme. If your box is not connected to the internet and you don't have a name server set, you're going to have a hard time with automatic license activation. Now, that's okay. You can still do it manually, but it's a lot easier if you can do it automatically. Getting this information from your end user can sometimes be problematic. Some end users are better about it than others, but that's okay. You don't have to use the client's internal DNS. You could use an external DNS. This is a Google address that I typically use for DNS. So make sure you set that. Also, make sure you just set one address. This isn't really going to work out well for you. So let's just keep it at one address here. Now, let me go to time server and where this is important. If you don't set a time server, this time is going to start to drift. Talked to a partner, I guess it was about a month ago, and he was working in a school system. And this particular school system was unlocking doors, between classes to let students move between buildings. And the bell was ringing at one time, and then 3 minutes later, the doors unlocked because the time had started to drift, and there was no NTP server set or time server as we have it listed here. So make sure you put a time server here. I believe this is a valid address, but make sure that if you do put a valid address in here. Obviously, if you put in a name here and you don't have a name server up here, that's not going to do you any good because it's never going to be able to resolve the name to an IP address. So time zone, also important. Most people get this one right. I don't run into too many systems where the time zone's not set properly, but just pay attention to it as you go through. Now, one other thing that I'm going to point out on this page, and this one I would say probably, I'd go 80, maybe 90% of the systems I log into. Right here, 1 million transactions. That's how many events are stored on the system. So every time somebody swipes their card, every time somebody logs into the system, that generates an event. 1 million transactions, that might be small, or that might be okay for a small system, with a couple doors and, maybe 100 users and, they don't really move around a whole lot, that might be okay. But for larger systems, you get up into the 100 readers, thousands of users. If you have it set to this default amount, you're probably only going to get a month, maybe 2 months of transactions. So this one I would pay attention to. And just, we don't have commas in here when we actually store the value, but just to get an idea, this is set at 1 million. You're going to want to bump that up. If you want to be more precise about it, you could, once you get the system commissioned, you could run a transaction report, for the last 24 hours, and that'll give you an idea of, roughly how many transactions you generated in a day, and obviously you multiply that by the time that the, end user wants to store.
Hey, Rob, sorry to interrupt. Rob,
yes.
Would you mind zooming in on your screen a little bit, getting some feedback that it's kind of hard to see your screen?
Okay, sure. Let me do that.
Thank you.
How about that? Is that a little better?
Much better. Thank you.
Perfect.
Hey, this Rob, sorry again. Rob, this might be bandwidth related as well. We got a complaint that the image is not that clear. So for folks on the phone, if you have your camera turned on, just go ahead and turn off your camera, because we're not going to use that anyway, and that probably saves some bandwidth. Thanks. Sorry, Rob.
No problem. Is it coming in clear now, or clearer now that I've zoomed in?
Yeah, looking good.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. So let's go to max days stored. This feature was just recently added. This is good for customers that have very strict data retention policies. Perhaps after a year, they want to make sure all transactions have been deleted. In this case, you would set, if 1 year is their retention period, you would set this to 365 days. Now, when I do that, you're going to get a pop-up here that says transactions will be deleted when the max stored transactions or max days stored limit is surpassed, whichever occurs first. So you don't have to set this value, but you have that option here. Now, the rest of this information, you'll pretty much leave this as is. Web server port, we do have a few customers out there that maybe for security reasons or other reasons, they don't want to use the default 443 port to access ACM. If you want to change that, you can certainly do that here. Finally, the SMTP server, this is completely optional. If you don't have a customer that wants to either receive reports via email, or a customer that wants to be able to receive alerts via email, if you don't have that scenario, then you don't need to fill out the SMTP server. Okay, so I'm going to move on. I'm going to cancel out of my changes here, but then we're going to go over to ports. Normally, you wouldn't cancel out of your changes there. So one of the things that I mentioned about ports earlier, there are 2 ports on the back of the appliance, but you don't. Both of these ports aren't really usable for communication, out to panels. So you're going to want to use port 1. That's where you're going to want to change this IP address to match whatever the customer's environment is. On port 2, I highly recommend you leave it at the default. This is this address will allow you to connect when you connect your laptop directly. You probably won't even have to set your IP address. Your laptop will automatically assign an address within this range. So then you could connect to the ACM server for service. But just remember, this port is not routable. I see this sometimes. People try to put an address on here and try to get panels communicating over this port. It's probably not going to work. So let's go over, I'm going to skip backups for a second, not because backups aren't important, but one of the things too you're going to want to check when you initially set the system up is see which version of software you're running. Especially in the cases where maybe you've received your equipment 6 months ago, and you're just now to the point that you're ready to install the server. There's a good chance that you're running behind. Now, in this case, my system is up to date, but you'll probably find that maybe you're 1 or 2 revisions behind. So now, obviously, it's very easy to say you need to update your software, but where do you get that software? Again, this might be a review for most of you, but just to let you know, all software is stored on the partner portal. And when I spell Avigilon correctly, we'll get there. So sorry, folks, I got a new laptop today, so I don't have all of my passwords saved yet. So apologize for the delay here. So once you log into the portal, you're going to go to software, And then there will be a menu that pops up on the left here. Now, depending on the age of your appliance, more than likely it's going to be on at least ACM 6. It's possible you may still have one out there if you've had your appliance, in the warehouse for quite a while. Possible you'll have one on 5, but you'll probably be starting on ACM 6. So you're going to go here. You're going to want to make sure that you get the upgrade file. Just remember that you have to upgrade incrementally. So if you're on 6.0, you're not going to be able to go directly to 6.4. You'll need to get a 6.2 upgrade file and then go to 6.4. Now, also keep in mind too, if you're doing a virtual deployment, here is where you get the OVA template. You'll need to provide this to your end user, and they'll have to load it to their virtual server. This is where you download it. So I'm going to go back here. So again, go to About to check your software version. Make sure you're on the current version. If you're not, go here to Software Update. Once you download the files from the partner portal, you'll simply add the software. You'll browse to the file and then click Save. It will upload to the server, and then you simply click the green check mark. Now, I'm going to skip over to backups. I started to configure a backup in here earlier just to test that my Windows share was connecting, but here is another big one that I see when I look at systems out there. And I'm not talking about systems that were just recently deployed. I'm talking about systems that have been in production for, a couple years. It's, I would say, probably 50% of the systems out there, no backups configured. Another common issue that I run into is if there's there may only be one backup configured. And as you guys know, there are two databases that need to be backed up. You have the configuration database, which obviously is all your configuration data, all your users, all your or identities, I should say, all your panels, your roles, access group schedules, all of that stuff lives in the configuration database. So that's half of the equation. The other piece that you need to make sure that you set up a backup for is the transaction database. A lot of people don't know that there's two different databases, so keep that in mind. You should always see two backups here. So in this case, I've set up a Windows share. It's going off to another machine of mine. Now, we generally recommend that you at least run a daily backup. Now, good question to ask your end user is, how much data can you afford to lose? If you have a large customer and they're adding 100 people a day, you may want to do more frequent backups than just daily. You may want to do them every 6 hours or maybe every 12 hours. You can do that within the ACM. All you would do in this case is you would just set up another. In this case, I'm doing, actually I should put configuration here. I'm doing the configuration backup. You would just create another configuration backup, set it to happen daily, and just set the start time as, whatever interval you want to set it to. So you can have multiple backup jobs running. You're not limited to just two. So make sure you have two backups at a minimum: transaction backup and a configuration backup. Now, I think the reason a lot of these backups don't get configured is because you guys will be out doing an installation. You ask the end user for hey, I need a Windows share to put backup files in, or I need you to provide a USB drive to connect directly to the appliance, and you receive nothing back. So if that happens, and you can't get anything back from the end user, then I would at least do a backup to local of the configuration database. And what that does is that we'll run a backup. It will drop the backup file on the ACM appliance. So that's half the battle. The next thing you need to do, obviously, if you have a hard drive failure, you're going to lose not just ACM, but you're going to lose your backup if you don't take that next step and actually download that file to your computer. So just this is where it's done. You just do it to local drive, pick which database you want to back up. I'm going to back up now. This is going to run pretty quick. And now you'll see you've got the option to download this to your computer. So at least get something, because especially these large systems where you all spend weeks getting the system configured, at least have that initial backup that you can turn to. But again, I would consider this a major issue. I would really press your end users to provide either the Windows share or provide a USB drive if you don't already provide that as part of your scope of work. Okay, so we're going to move on now. Couple other things that I want to mention. I'm going to go up here. I'm going to go down to System Settings. Another setting, this is one that comes up a lot. I get a lot of calls about this. Enhanced access level. So with Mercury controllers, you are by default, you're limited to 8 access groups per user per token. Now that can be expanded to 16. So if you want to expand that to 16 access groups per user per token, per panel, I should add that in there, you're going to want to check this box. Something else that you'll want to pay attention to down here is your default token expiration time. A lot of people forget this is here. And I have a lot of end users when I talk to them ask, I really want to set my token expiration date to 5 years, and I don't want to have to do that manually on each token. So here's a place you can go and actually set that so that will be your default token expiration time. Okay, so I'm going to move over. I'm actually going to switch over to my system real quick. I don't have any panels actually set up here, so we're going to move over to my demo system. Now, Jared, I believe it was Friday. Jared went through great presentation on using templates and how to use the batch create process, when you get to the point of adding your panels and your sub panels and your doors. So I'm not going to go through that today. If you guys want to see that presentation, we do have that saved out on Box, so you can go back and review that presentation. But for today, we're going to assume that the panels have already been set up and configured. But I want to walk through a couple things that I see, when I look at systems out there. Now, this one here, you'll notice I pulled up one of my panels. You'll notice that the firmware is actually up to date. This is not very typical. There's a lot of systems I log into, and the controller firmware is several revisions behind. So you're going to want to check to update firmware. You simply click on the firmware box. You find the type of controller that you have, and you obviously want to pick the most current version, and then you'll simply apply it. Now, if you're on an older server and you need to apply a newer version of firmware that's not on this server, if tech support advises you to install a newer version of firmware, if you need to get those firmware files onto the server, you can simply download those files to your computer and then click here to add those firmware files. When you do that, it'll allow you to browse to those files, and then you can add them to the server and then you'll have the option to apply those to your panels. So remember, check your firmware. Definitely make sure you get it updated to the most current supported version before you leave the site. Now, something else that I want to mention, I talked about controller firmware, but you also have sub-panel firmware. So that's something that often gets missed. So if I go down, if I drill down to my sub panels here, I picked an MR52. You can click on same thing as you had with the panels. You have a firmware box. You can click on this and then go through and actually apply your firmware. Now, a couple other things I want to mention here, and I configured this purposely so that you would see it. One of the things that I see in a lot of systems, and it ends up generating questions. It's not. This is more of a benign thing, but it can lead end users to think that there's issues. Because a lot of times when we talk to end users and we talk to our partners, we say green is good, red is bad. Well, when you set up, when you go through and you set up your panels and your sub panels and your doors, especially the case with an MR52, you've got 8 inputs, but you typically only use 4. You use 2 for your door contacts and 2 for your recs, and you've got 4 inputs left. So what a lot of people do is they don't configure those inputs. So by default, the inputs will show an alarm. So here's typically what you see on an input that has not been configured. You'll open it up, the end of line resistance has not been set, so the system thinks it's an alarm. So what I would highly recommend you do with your unused inputs is go here and set it to normally open, no end of line resistance. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea to go ahead and label this as a spare input, because that's another thing I will see in a lot of systems. Inputs will have the default name, which would lead me to think that that input is spare, but actually that input is being used for something. So make sure you label your inputs appropriately if it's being used for a special purpose. Obviously, when you create the doors and you assign an input to a door position switch or a REX, it's going to automatically rename it for you. But when you have an input being used for something like a door release or something like that, it's not going to automatically rename it for you. So just keep that in mind. Label your inputs and set your end of line resistance, especially for those ones that are not being used. So you'll notice now that I've set this to normally open, no end of line resistance, it's going to go to green when we go back to status. So that input 2 is now showing green, and so now that won't show as an input point in alarm. If you want to, you could go, these are unused outputs. You could simply label these. Once you label them, I'll just put spare here. If you click on install and save it, you'll go back and you'll no longer have that showing in yellow. So anyway, just a helpful tip. It might, eliminate a service call or a call from the end user that's, that thinks that maybe something is wrong with their system because they're seeing a lot of red, or they're seeing information pop up in events that alarm points are an alarm. Okay, so at this point, what I'd like to do is open it up for questions. I think there's been a lot of questions come in, so I want to make sure I leave time to address all of those. So if you guys want to come off mute, and if there are any questions that that haven't been addressed in the chat, I'll try to look through here real quick.
Hey, Robbie, here's one question for you. Someone
Sure.
asked into the chat. why the enhanced access levels are not checked or enabled by default. Any downside of that?
I guess the downside, if you enable it, it does take additional memory. So be less of things that you could store on the panel. I don't know. I find that a lot of people run into that issue and end up calling tech support because they don't have enough access groups. So I don't know. It's really your decision whether you want to enable it or not. I don't know. Do you have anything else to add to that, Francisco?
Well, yeah. As you said, it does take some memory out of the panel, right? So you can add somewhat less number of identities, but it's not significant, right? So if someone wants to enable that, I don't see a whole lot of problems in doing so. Yeah,
same here. I just go ahead and enable it to try to cut down on the calls to tech support, or more importantly, it's not the calls to the tech support that's the problem. It's the end user, experiencing an issue with the problem. Of course, we want to minimize the issues that the end user experiences.
Just to give people an idea, Rob, in what we're talking about, right? So by default, when you create a panel, it assigns or allocates space of panel for 100,000 credentials. That means that panel can hold 100,000 credentials. Rarely we see someone using that, right? So if you don't allocate, or if you check that enhanced access level, so I'm looking at a 1501 controller, I can enter a maximum of 124,805 identities. Now, if I remove that enhanced, I'm doing this right now. And if I do that and I go back to that same panel and change it, I can now go and enter, let's see here, 148,000. So basically you lose 20,000 credentials, ability to add 20,000 credentials into that system. So in other words, with no enhanced, you can do 148. With enhanced, you can do 124,000. Which is not a problem for the majority of our customers. That's not even a problem.
Right, and those customers that do have that large number of identities, they're probably going to have more than 8 access groups. So you're going to have to turn it on anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
So one thing I did want to, was there another question?
No, go ahead, sorry.
One thing that I saw that Bill mentioned in the chat, items per page. This is a good one. I really should have added that in there. So by default, the system sets the items per page to 20. And so where this is an issue, when you go to reports is a good example. You pull this up, it only displays 20 items on the page, so you have to scroll to the next page. And you'll see that throughout the software. But a real simple setting you can do, and this is done on a per account basis. So if you go up to the user icon here, you go down to my account, just bump that up to 40. That's a good setting. Of course, you can bump it up to whatever you like. You can go even more than 40 if you want, but 40 is a good happy medium. We'll set that. Now when you go to reports is a good example. You'll go here. Now you'll see all the reports on one page and you don't have to scroll. Couple of other things I'm seeing in the chat. Let's see, I'll take this one first here from Gene. Show how to configure a new identity and a login password. Okay. So this is probably a good one too to tackle. You know, we talk about how to add users, and you know, when you add a user to your system, you know, you've got the minimum information. You need the last name and you need the first name. But one of the other things that we should probably cover, put John Smith in here, is, you know, maybe John Smith's going to be an administrator for the system, and John Smith doesn't need to just get through doors. John Smith needs to be able to log into the system. So after you configure his identity, you're going to want to go down here and set up a login. So this will be the username that John Smith uses to access the system, and then you'll need to set the password. Now, you'll notice that I skipped remote login. Probably, well, I would say 99.9% of your users will not have a remote login. And I believe, Francisco, you may have mentioned this on your presentation, but that remote login is only used to make to connect to the transaction database, you know, remotely. That's the only time that you'll use that remote login. A lot of people confuse that. They think if they set that up, that means that, you know, from anywhere on the internet, if they use that login, they'll be able to connect to ACM, and that's not the case. Also, I think Gene wanted me to point out inactivity timer. So by default, it's 10 minutes. So 10 minutes of no activity, you're going to automatically be logged out of the system. You can obviously, there's many other settings here. Be very careful with this one, indefinite. We like to think that when people get up from their desk, they hit Control-Alt-Delete and lock their screen, but we know there's a lot of people that don't. If you leave this as an indefinite, that's actually what it means, indefinite. It will stay logged in. If you go home, the cleaner, obviously, or whoever comes in after you will have full access to your access control system. But just be mindful of that. Use indefinite sparingly. I dare say don't use it in a production environment, but again, that's my opinion. So I think that covered, Gene, I think that covered your question. Certainly let me know if it did not. I think we also had a question about the SMTP notifications. So again, I've switched over to my demo system. I do have SMTP set up here. So a lot of this information is really going to depend on which mail service you're using, or probably more likely you're using the end user's internal mail service. But you're going to want to get this information from the end user. Once this is set up, you can generate a test email to this account. So this is the account you're going to be sending from, but what you can do to make sure you're connecting to the server is actually hit the send test email. Now, if you're having problems here, we do have a knowledge base article that talks about connecting to some of your more popular mail services like Yahoo, Gmail, so on and so forth. Just keep in mind that I've noticed this. Actually, I switched from using Yahoo to Gmail because Yahoo kept changing settings, and I would have to go in here and make updates here to keep this working. But this is where you would actually set the server up. Now, if you want to send alarms to a certain email address, then you would set that up at the event type level, or possibly even the event level if you want to get drilled down to a specific event. Let's see some of the other questions we have here.
Hey, yeah. Rob, real quick on the SMTP stuff, because I think it would be a good kind of setting up the system. Will you show like how that email notification, you know, once you have it set up, you can apply an event to send out an email?
Yep, certainly. Let's do that. So if you want to send out a specific event or send an email out regarding a specific event, let's do 4-store. So I just searched for the event. I'm going to go here. I'm going to open up the event, and I can put in an email address here. And so one thing to keep in mind about or when we talk about these alerts, email alerts, this basically will send out anytime this event is generated on the server. So this doesn't work in tandem with routing groups. So keep that in mind. It's kind of an all or nothing with email. Anytime this is triggered, it will send out an email. One of the things that I recommend, because you can only put 5 addresses in here, it will allow you to put more, but it's only going to send to the first 5 people, is use a distribution group. And that's also good for when people leave an organization. It is so much easier to change the members of an email distribution group than to actually go into all of these events and change the email addresses. So just keep that in mind. Okay, let me see what other questions we have here.
Yeah, Marty has a question about testing network connectivity from the appliance to the panels.
Oh, that's a good question.
Or I'm sorry, from the appliance to the internet, which the answer is no.
There's not an yeah. If you run into a scenario, you could contact tech support. They have ways that they could probably test it, but there is no way through the app through the web browser that you can do that kind of test.
There is another question, Rob, about where errors, like SMTP errors, would go. I do believe that's in the logs.
Yeah, need to look here.
Yeah, there is one there for
test email.
Test email, that's right. And Rob, if you don't mind complementing something here, when we talk about
Sure.
the emails back there, right? Be careful with that, because if you go in an event and you set an email address, you're going to receive an email for every single event related to, let's say I'm going to do door forced event, for example. If I set an email address for a generic for the event door forced, any door force or any door held, whatever that is, I'm going to get an email for every single one of them. So you gotta be careful with that. So there's a way that you can create a local event related to that particular door that you're interested in receiving an event, and then you can go and post, and then you can enter your email address there, and now you're just getting an event for that particular door that you're interested. That's what Rob is doing right now. Okay, you would go to events over there and then pick the event that you want. So he already got one there, so he could go there and set that. See what says a panel temper up there, or lock down that one right there. So he can go and put the one of those are good. So this is a local event related to this particular panel. So he only going to get a notification if this is triggered, not every single one of them. Okay, just be aware of that.
Yep.
Hey, Rob, this is Marty.
Okay.
Back to that question around communications.
Yes.
Can you point us to log or event files that can be used to determine, communication failures to the network or internet, and also diagnostic between the appliance and controllers?
So let's go here. So we'll start here at logs. and team, feel free to help me here. So communications between the panels and the appliance, is that going to show up in how?
In Rails. I would go in Rails first.
Yeah, Rails.
Go Rails first. Okay.
Right.
So your Rails log.
Yeah.
And then as far as communications to the internet, I don't know that it's going to show anything in the Rails logs.
Yeah, there's nothing currently built into ACM that's going to give you, traffic stats or connectivity stats to the internet. Really, the only way to test that is from an internet connected device back to ACM. So, Marty, hopefully if I understand your question correctly, is if you've got an appliance in one location and panels in another location across the internet, or operators in another location across the internet, can I connect back to my appliance? Really, the best way to test that is to make your network changes at the appliance site for port forwarding or opening up the specified web ports and Mercury communication ports. And then from the client side, just from a Windows machine or any machine that can ping or trace route or whatever, trace back to the appliance. And yes, Andy, because I know you and I have talked about this before, a ping utility would be great inside of our appliance, and it is a feature enhancement request that we have asked for. So we are working on that. One of the things Rob's showing you right here is we do have the ability to turn on additional logging called the debug logs. However, that is basically only used for technical support. So we recommend that you never turn on debug unless you're on the phone with tech support or tech support is asking for additional logging. Essentially, all of our network testing would be done from the shell. However, we do have our dashboard that Rob can show you and explain that will give you some panel communication messages and things like that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. The specific issue that I had was with a VM and not being certain that the VM interfaces are set up correctly. So, once you load the appliance into the VM, there could be challenges with the VM network interfaces. And when you go to license the appliance, the issue that I had is you go to license the appliance via the online mechanism and it fails. And so you're not sure, is it an issue with the licensing or is it an issue with the connectivity? In my instance, I rolled up another, like a Linux operating system on the VM and used it to test connectivity to the internet via the network interfaces, and was able to, validate that I had network connectivity. But if there was some mechanism through the appliance to be able to tell, you're at least hitting the license server, would be really good. But the other issue that I had was in connecting to controllers. I've connected to several different controllers, including some older kind of takeover stuff, and had kind of hit and miss results. A couple of the controllers came online pretty quick, and then another controller I just could not get to connect. And there's no information to know. Like one controller, a connectivity issue was that the controller address was set to, I think, 1, and it needed to be 0. But in ACM, there's not really a spot to designate that controller address, but it does care. So if the controller is not set to, I think in that instance it needed to be 0, ACM would not connect to it. But there wasn't an error message or any way to identify that. It was just trial and error of turning settings off and on.
Yeah, I think, I like your suggestion about having maybe a ping utility or something like that. Or even in the case of the license server, it's a green light or red light that indicates whether you're connecting to it or not. That's definitely something that we can suggest. And then, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, yeah, with VMs, I've had trouble too getting through firewalls and things like that. You know, as far as the license activation, that's where I would probably switch over to the manual activation instead of spending a whole lot of time troubleshooting it. Especially if you're not going to use any internet resources other than just for the license activation. Hopefully your end user has an NTP time source that you can use locally. You know, obviously if not, you know, then troubleshooting the internet connection probably is going to be a little bit more important if you're going to have to go out for NTP. And I'm sorry, Francisco, did you have another comment to add up?
Yeah, I was just about to say, in regards to the license, if you can't connect when you're trying to register the license, if you can't reach the server, it will tell you right there that server is unreachable. And then, as you said, then you can proceed to do the manual licensing process. Right? Unless you're accessing the application from the outside, from the internet, is one of the few things that you need to have ACM on internet for. Everything else, basically, as Robert just said, you can go and assign a local time server, NTP server, right, to keep everything in check, and that should be fine. So that's all I had to add.
Perfect. Thanks, Francisco. You know, one thing I want to ask, I know we're close to out of time here, but since we have such a big group today, I'd love to hear some feedback on maybe some future topics that you guys would like us to run through. And also, while you guys are thinking about that, just a reminder, we're doing these lunch and learns Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Francisco is doing Mondays, I'm doing Wednesdays, and Jared is doing Fridays, and we're doing them in our respective time zones from noon to 1. So hopefully that will give you know, people across the U.S. different chances or different time frames that they can join. Francisco's in Eastern, I'm in the Central time zone, and Jared's in the Pacific time zone. So any suggestions?
One thing to add in there, you guys probably saw a whole lot of meeting requests coming in, so we are adjusting our meetings, making them reoccurrent and so on. You will see them change because on the reoccurrent it has a title. So if you look at mine for next Monday, it says reporting. It won't be reporting. I already did reporting last week. So we will see those coming in. We're also looking for maybe a better method of doing this, one that can hold more people, that can be a little bit more interactive. So if you see us canceling the meeting and sending a new meetings out, that's the reason why. So just bear with us until we can figure out a more efficient way of doing all this and having you know, those meetings squared in an easy format for everyone. Okay. There's one more question there, Rob. What determines whether the MAC address shows up in the panel list? Andrew, if you want to go ahead and open up your line and just rephrase that. I'm not exactly sure I understood that question.
I think he's.
Go ahead. Yeah.
He's gone?
I think he's talking about on the panels page. So if you look on my panels page, I've only got a couple servers that are controllers that are displaying the MAC address.
Yeah, that's. I'll be honest. I believe it's a hit or miss thing with ACM. It is possible that the panel's not reporting because the controller just isn't including it in the host name. Yeah, we've seen that just hit or miss, unfortunately.
Is that controller calling back?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say, Francisco. Go ahead and check. Click on that first controller that's showing the MAC address. I think that's configured. When they're configured as IP client connect,
exactly,
it displays the MAC address. So if you go to host.
Oh, I think this one's configured. Yeah.
No, it isn't.
IP server.
Yeah. It's interesting. Typically, that will show up when it is IP client connect.
You know, it's funny because I'm looking at mine. Mine has no MAC addresses, and I got a bunch of controllers in here. So maybe in one point, Rob, you had those controllers set for callback for Mac.
Oh, I could have been. They've been all kinds of different settings.
Yeah, that might be.
So,
it.
or I could just tell you all they're all there. It's just the screen hasn't refreshed yet. But no, that's not actually the case. So one thing I do want to mention, you know, we're down to 1 minute. If you do have suggestions, feel free to email them to myself or the other SEs. You know, love to hear your feedback if there's specific topics that you guys are interested in. And obviously, if we get a lot of responses back for a particular topic, that's the one we're going to lean towards. Otherwise, we'll keep picking topics. So with that being said, if any final questions before we wrap up?
Just what is the topic for the next one?
To be determined. I'll be sending out a updated invite later this afternoon. So if you want to have.
For this Friday.
For my.
You're talking about for Jared. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So for mine on Friday, we're going to be covering unification between ACM and ACC. Really, a lot of the tips and tricks on one, how to make it work, and two, what you can do with it. So great series for anyone out there who's got ACM and ACC or would like to know, you know, what we can really do when we combine our two systems together. So going to be a great topic and looking forward to it.
Yeah, sounds good. So, yeah, you guys be sure to join on Friday. If you don't have the invite, reach out to one of us. We'll make sure you have it. And thank you all again for joining, and we'll see you on the next call.
Nice work, Rob. Thanks.
Thank you all.